Hello, welcome to Making Photos. I'm Ian Butterfield. In this particular video, we're going to turn our attention to the topic of theatre photography. Now, I'm down at Chad's Theatre in Cheadle-Hulme, and I've chosen this opportunity to talk about theatre because I'm actually in the play.
No damage done yet. Now, let's see what we've got. Not much, I'm afraid.
What's that in your hand?
Oh, just a bill, I suppose.
We're putting on Gaslight, a Victorian thriller, and I'm playing the part of the detective Ruff. Normally, I'm here doing the photography instead of acting. And I thought this would be a good chance for me to talk about how we as photographers cover theatrical productions, such as Gaslight and some of the other plays that I've covered. So, let's start by talking about when we do theatre photography. We don't tend to do it during the actual performance. It's invariably at the dress rehearsal. Now, there are various reasons why we photograph at a dress rehearsal rather than a performance. The primary reason is so that you're not a distraction to the audience. It also means that you get more freedom to move around in the auditorium to get a variety of angles. Never assume that the dress rehearsal is going to be the night before the production. In some places, there are 2 dress rehearsals, and the director would prefer it if you photograph the first one. In fact, I prefer it to photograph the first dress rehearsal rather than a second dress rehearsal when there's 2. The reason for that is the one directly before opening night needs to have as fewer distractions as possible for the cast, so it's better to do the first one. Some theatres have 2 dress rehearsals, so it could be the 2 nights before. Some have the dress rehearsals a night off and then the performance. So it does vary on that. So always check when the dress rehearsal is going to be. Make sure you're familiar with the theatre beforehand. If you can get down there, see a production there, something like that, that's the ideal. But if you can't, ask some questions. And one particular thing to ask about, and this may seem strange, but how high is the stage? Why do I say that? Well, I once photographed a production of The Wizard of Oz. Here's the image on screen. Can you see what the problem is? The problem is you can't see Dorothy's ruby red slippers. And why is that? Because I hadn't taken into account the fact that it was a tall stage and I'm not a tall person. So I now know that if I'm photographing at that particular theatre, I need to bring a set of step ladders with me. When you're photographing a production, I would always advise trying to arrive at least half an hour beforehand because there are a few things that you'll need to do during that time. Firstly, you'll need to, if possible, have a chat with the director of the show. And there are certain things you need to find out. Make sure that they are comfortable with where you're intending to photograph from. I have done productions where I've had directors say, I don't really like you being near the front of the stage. It doesn't happen very often, and I think these days I've won over those directors on that. But just trying to find out where they're comfortable with letting you have. Try to find out if there is any particular action that you need to capture in the production, anything that happens suddenly. For example, this image on the screen now comes from the play Lend Me a Tenner, and it was towards the end. There was a particular point in the play where I think it was a couple of characters kissing, and then all of a sudden all the doors opened, everyone popped their heads out, reacted to it, and back again. And it's only about 5 seconds that particular image was there on stage. So I had to be ready for it. I had to have the right lens. So find out if there's anything like that, and find out what happens directly beforehand so that you can be in position, you can be ready to get that all-important shot. Also, find out whether the cast use the auditorium. It's some plays, Gaslight never would. It's always going to be framed on stage. But in some plays you have action within the audience. You may have people entering through side doors which come into the auditorium. I have had the instance in the past where I was stood by a door and all of a sudden the door directly behind me was flung open and somebody in the cast was walking through it. I need to know that sort of thing if people are going to be coming in that way, when it's going to be, so I'm not going to be in their way. In addition to talking to the director, it would also be good to try and talk to the lighting director or a lighting operator to find out what light you've got to play with. In some productions, the lighting can be very, very low. For example, in this image you can see of Journey's End, the lighting was so low that my shutter speed to get the shot had to be half a second. And that meant I had to brace the camera to create the image. So be aware of that. Also, if there's going to be a lot of lighting changes, is the lighting going to be consistent across the stage, equal brightness across the whole area? That will affect what settings you're going to use and how you set your camera up. So for example, if the lighting's changing a lot, I would personally work in aperture priority mode because I find it easier to move from one set of light to another. If the lighting was constant across the stage, I might go into manual mode with the knowledge that things aren't going to change very much. Once I've got my exposure set, then I know I can just concentrate on getting the images without having to think about what settings I have on the camera. And talking about settings on the camera, let's go and have a chat about how you configure your camera for theatre photography. Before we talk about settings, let's talk about general photographer's equipment if you're doing theatre photography. Obviously you're going to need a camera, and a camera which has good capability in high ISO settings and low noise would be really helpful. You'll need fast lenses, wide apertures. I tend to shoot f4, f2.8, depending which lens I'm using on the camera. What else will you need? You will either need to be able to find your way around your camera in the dark, or you'll need to bring a torch with you, so that if you need to adjust anything, you can find out what you're doing. If you're going to be changing lenses a lot, one piece of equipment you might find helpful is a photographer's waistcoat, with all the pockets to put different lenses in. So as you move around, you've got the opportunity to swap your lenses nice and easily. As I mentioned earlier about checking out a location, you might also need step ladders if you need to be raised up to be able to see onto the stage. One of the biggest challenges facing a theatre photographer is dynamic range. And if you're not familiar with the problems of dynamic range, take a look at the video somewhere up there where I talk through the whole process on that. The basic problem is the whites will be too white, the blacks will be too black on there, and you will lose detail in both ends. You just need to decide what's important and set your exposure accordingly. I find there's generally 3 different ways of setting your camera up for theatre photography. And those are using aperture priority mode, either with a constant ISO, aperture priority with the camera controlling the ISO, or in complete manual mode for getting your exposure. Let's talk about each of those in turn. If you're going to use aperture priority mode, you're almost certainly going to need to, what I refer to as riding the exposure compensation, because you will find that the highlights will blow out. You'll need to set your ISO to something that's appropriate for the lighting on the particular production that you're photographing. Now, I would say start at ISO 800 and adjust from there. If it goes down to really low light, you are going to have to bang up your ISO quite a bit. If it's a very well lit play, you might even be able to bring it down a fraction on there. My own preference is I tend to use the second method, which is aperture priority mode, but with a variable ISO. You can set on the back of your camera a range that you will allow the ISO setting to move through. In my case, I set the range to be ISO 100 as the minimum, and then going all the way up to 12,500. And as part of those settings, I tell the camera to keep the shutter speed faster than 1/125th of a second. Even then, I find I'm still riding the exposure compensation all the time. So I'm taking a shot, checking the image on the back of the camera and adjusting the exposure compensation. And actually you find after a while you can look at the scene and you can guess how much exposure compensation you need. The important thing is to keep an eye on the faces of the actors. Make sure they don't blow out. And I would strongly recommend you set those blinking highlights, exposure warnings, to make sure that the faces don't blow out. Everything else you can, to be honest, it's quite forgiving, is theatre photography, for the shadows most of the time. As long as the faces aren't blown out, you'll get away with most things. The third possible way of setting your camera up is to do spot metering. And use that in manual mode. Now, this is a much harder way of working. I do use this approach occasionally, but I tend to reserve it for those times when the lighting is even across the stage and I know that the lighting isn't going to change frequently. The way you do it is you put your camera in manual mode, enable the center point, put that on the face of one of your actors, adjust your settings so the little caret marker at the bottom is on 0, and you can then effectively lock in that exposure, knowing that the faces will be correctly exposed so long as the lighting doesn't change, and that includes across the stage as well. And I've used that quite successfully, as in these example photos from caretakers at the Library Theatre in Manchester. Now let's talk about white balance. White balance is an interesting one with theatre photography, and the first thing to say is you almost certainly don't want accurate white balance. Now that may seem strange, but look at it this way. Take a look at these two photos from Kindertransport, and both of those images have been colour corrected so that the colours of the set and the costumes are totally accurate. Unfortunately, that's not what the director and the lighting director want. The play, in this case, is set across 2 time zones. They use the same set for the 2 different time zones, and so the audience know whether we're in wartime or the 1970s. It's all down to the lighting that's being used, with the wartime having blue lighting and the 1970s having a very warm orange lighting on there. So if I was to colour correct those images, I would be taking away something that the director and the lighting director had deliberately put in there. In other words, the colour cast to indicate the different time zones. So don't try to make your lighting, quote, natural all the time. A good starting point for white balance in theatre photography is set your camera to tungsten or incandescent if you're a Nikon user, white balance setting. That will give you the equivalent of white light. Most of the lights here are effectively tungsten-based lights, although these days they're increasingly becoming LED ones, but the colour temperature tends to remain about the tungsten levels on there. And if you set your white balance to that, any colour casts that you get then are generally caused by the gels which are placed in front of them. So that's the best way to do it. Now, does that mean you never have to change the white balance? No, not at all. I find I quite often need to enhance the white balance in post-production. Sometimes the camera doesn't quite record it in the same way that the eyes perceive it. It may look too blue or too orange or too red or whatever, and I have to adjust that to return it to how it felt when I was watching the play. So I'm not just watching the action to take the photos, I'm watching the action and registering that in order to be able to process the images correctly. So now let me give you a few tips on how to compose your images for theatre photography. When you're thinking about the composition of your images, think about the different things that you need to achieve with it. It's very tempting in theatre photography just to set a tripod up in the middle of the auditorium and just position yourself there and record what you see from there. That's what the audience will see, that's what I'm going to record. However, it's so much better to try and get that range of angles on your shots instead of just providing the audience perspective. If you can provide images that are different to what the audience sees, then when the audience is leaving and they're looking at the photos as they're going out, they will have a much more interesting experience of viewing those images, because it's not what they saw exactly. It's a different perspective on what they saw. So let's have a look at a whole load of images now. I'll talk you through them and I'll tell you a few hints and tips about how I photograph them. So we can see here on screen an image from David Copperfield. Now this is a good example of an image taken from the audience perspective. It's a nice shot and there's nothing wrong with doing a few images like that, but do try to vary your composition. Here in the next image from Gaslight, but not this production, different production of Gaslight, we've got Mr. and Mrs. Manningham, and it was I shot it low down, near stage level, and a slight tilt on the camera, just to give that slightly different perspective on things. And talking of tilts with images, here from The Odd Couple, again, I've shot from really low down to create this tilt and an angle in there, just to make the image look a little bit more interesting. And again, also works well with this shot from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory of the four grandparents, which actually, that particular one, with the straight on version, just didn't work quite as well. Think also about where you shoot from. And one of the things I like to do and encourage theatre photographers to do is to think about their position in shooting. Consider shooting from the edges of the stage, so maybe down here to get some shots. And yes, sometimes we do end up kneeling on the floor or even lying on the floor to get the shots that we require. And you can see on screen now a couple of examples of how effective that type of shot can be. But you also want to capture the entire stage. So make sure you get either wide angle or far enough back to get the full set in there. And if you can get a clean shot of the set without any actors on it, that's also worth doing, because of course the set design people will want a good record of what they've created, especially if you can get it under the stage lighting as well. And talking of stage lighting, don't be afraid to include the stage lights in your shots, because that adds a different perspective on the images and a different variety, and really sets it in the context of being in a theatre. Think about the types of shots that you want. In addition to those sort of wide shots covering the whole stage, make sure you get some decent close-ups of your actors. Actors can be vain people, and they do like to have their photos, and getting the nice character shots of an actor, head and shoulders or full length, is also something that's important to add to the variety of shots. Think about 2 shots and 3 shots as well, where you've got a couple of characters interacting with each other, and those sorts of images work very well. One of the biggest problems that I hear from theatre photographers or people starting out doing theatre photography is how you deal with the expressions. Actors are talking, and if you're not careful, all their shots will look like they're gurning because you capture them in the mid-sentence. How do you deal with that? Well, there's 2 ways really. The first way is to wait for those pauses. Actors do have to breathe, just occasionally, even if we do have very long sentences sometimes. But when they take that breath, they take that pause, that can be the time just to capture the shot where they're not pulling a face or looking as though they're pulling a face. The other advice I'd give is don't just concentrate on the person who's speaking, keep a very close eye on the person who's been spoken to, because their reaction shots are probably the best ones you'll get. If they're laughing in response to something that's being said, or they're being sneaky behind someone's back, then you can get that reaction, and that tells the story. A couple of other final bits of advice. One thing just to be aware of when you are creating your images: if you're at a dress rehearsal, it might be tempting to use a row of empty seats as a framing device in your shots. Please don't, because if these images are going to be used for publicity for a theatre, then we can't use them if there's empty seats there, because the last thing you want to do is to present an image which shows nobody in the theatre. It sends the wrong message from a publicity point of view. So try to avoid empty seats. Now that can be fairly straightforward in a traditional theatre like this, but if you are photographing theatre in the round or a thrust stage, that can be a little bit harder. And one of the techniques that you can do is to try and hide the seats by positioning yourself so that the actor is between you and the seats on the other side, and that way you can disguise the fact that the theatre's empty. Or you can use that dynamic range we spoke about to allow the bits of the image in the background to go out of dynamic range into darkness, so that the empty seats aren't obvious there. So try and avoid that. A couple of practical tips for you now. When you're photographing, be aware that the actors are on stage and, in my case, struggling to remember lines and all that. We don't want somebody distracting us, so always try to keep out of the actor's eye line. So if I've got somebody standing here directly in front of me, I would photograph off to one side slightly so that I'm not in their eye line, and that will make it easier for them. The other thing is be definite with your movements. So don't go, oh, right, shall I photograph from here? No, Yes, I'll come over here and move. Don't do that kind of moving around. Start off by, if you were over here and you decided, I think I'm going to shoot over there, look where you're going to shoot from, decide that that's the angle you want to shoot from, and then just walk straight to it and then shoot from the other side like that. So that you are in place. Make it a definite move rather than a fussing around trying to find a location. But what about photographing from the wings? Well, it's certainly possible, but I need to give you a few particular warnings about that. I would never photograph from the wings of a production unless I really knew the production well. Because if you're standing, as per this shot, looking through the doorway, trying to get a shot of what's happening on stage, and you don't know the production, and somebody needs to rush onto stage or somebody is rushing off stage, you're just going to be in their way. Also, unlike now where I've got the working lights on, it's going to be dark, you could be in the way of stage crew. But you can get some really interesting shots from the wings. Here you can see Mrs. Warren's profession actually shot through a window from backstage, again during a rehearsal. Here, looking from the side of the stage, we have the dance sequence from She Stoops to Conquer. And probably my all-time favourite image shot from the wings is this of the three sisters in Chekhov's The Three Sisters. I was actually in the play and I was just about to go on stage. My camera was in the wings. I grabbed it, got this shot, put the camera down and then walked on stage to join them. In my own experience, I would only ever shoot from the wings for a production if I was involved in it, and that typically means I'm one of the actors, so that I know when people are coming on, when they're coming off, so that I'm not going to be in their way. Another location you might want to consider for photography is the dressing room. Well, this part of it is effectively our green room where we sit as actors before we go on. Just over that side is where there's two sections where people can change. A bit of advice about shooting in the dressing room. Yes, you might think it's a great idea to get the shots of the actors putting their makeup on and preparing and getting ready to do their performance. However, again, this comes with some warnings. First of all, make sure you've got permission and that everyone who's in the dressing room is comfortable with being photographed. Also, make sure you aren't photographing people while they're changing, fairly obviously on that. The other thing to keep in mind is that actors often like to have a little bit of space and quiet and without interruption when they're preparing to go on stage. I know I certainly do. And having somebody pointing a camera at me or telling me, oh, could you just do this, could you just do that, can break that concentration just before you go on. So yes, sometimes it's possible. Again, I tend not to do it, but if you want to, think about your actors and liaise with them and the director to make sure everybody is happy. Oh, and one final thing, watch out for mirrors. In dressing rooms there are so many mirrors, and when I'm photographing at Stockport Garrick, it's very, very difficult if I was taking shots in the dressing room to avoid getting myself with the camera in shot. So just keep an eye on the mirrors. Come and join me back in the auditorium and let me just talk you through a little bit about theatre etiquette. See you out there. I want to start off by talking about superstitions in the theatre. Now, in days gone by, actors were a very superstitious lot. I'm not superstitious at all, and I think it's fair to say that the number of people who are superstitious these days in the theatre is probably less than it used to be. However, I don't know who is concerned about certain traditions and who isn't. So as a photographer, when I'm working in a theatre, I do try to observe those traditions, and basically I just don't want to upset anyone. You don't want an actor who's about to go on stage being traumatised because you've done something which they think will bring bad luck. So what are the main ones to look out for? Well, there's a few well-known ones, such as, for example, we don't, as actors, wish each other good luck. We say break a leg. Now that comes from, well, could be various reasons for that phrase. Jokingly, people used to say it was the understudy who always wished the person they were understudying that, but I think that's highly unlikely. There are other connections with the killing of Abraham Lincoln which are also a little bit dubious. The most likely explanation is on a traditional stage, you've got the wings and you've got curtains at the side, and the actors would enter through those. In the days of music hall, not everyone managed to get on stage, because the way it worked is if an act was going really well, the impresario would leave them on stage for longer. And if you were a second-rate act and you may not even get on because other acts carried on for longer. And so to wish somebody to break a leg meant that they actually got the chance to go on stage. So that's where we believe it comes from. So don't wish your actors good luck, wish them break a leg. Another superstition is to do with the mentioning of a certain play, the Scottish play. That's what we refer to it as. By tradition, you only call it the name which is on the screen now when you are actually in the play or talking about the character in the context of the play. Now, I am not superstitious. I have no problem saying that name. However, I'm in a theatre. I don't wish to offend anyone, so I will always just refer to it as the Scottish play. The final superstition I just want to mention is about whistling, and it's particularly about whistling backstage. Is supposed to bring bad luck on a production. Now, that is because in the olden days, before we had walkie-talkies to communicate where everything was and what was going on and who was doing what, the scene shifters used to rely on whistles to indicate it was time to fly something in. A bit of scenery, and often that meant dropping a sandbag, and if you whistled, it might be really bad luck because the sandbag might get dropped on you inadvertently because somebody thinks it's a cue for some scenery to be moved. So please don't whistle when you're in a theatre. And what's the main reason to abide by theatre superstitions? Well, the key reason is because if you upset the actors or upset the crew, they're not going to buy your photos, are they? So there's a lot more I could say about theatre photography, but that's enough for this video. In a future video, I will talk all about how we do the post-processing and how we use the images that we've created. But until then, there's a playlist on the screen here that you can have a look at, other videos which will help your photography, and down below is one I recommend. So until next time, thanks for watching and keep making great photos. Bye for now.